Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In the early morning hours of March 10th, 2024, a two-story home in the Manoa Valley of Honolulu sat quietly beneath the thick palms and early fog. From the street, nothing looked unusual. The front door was shut. Mail sat undisturbed in the box. There were no shattered windows or cars peeled out across the curb. But inside, something had gone very, very wrong. Shortly before 9:15 a.m., Honolulu police received a 911 call from a man in his late 20s renting the small Ohana unit, a converted guest house behind the main residence. His voice was uneven. He said he'd heard screaming in the night, maybe around 2 a.m., but didn't think much of it at first. They stopped suddenly, he explained. Now I'm knocking and no one's answering. Their car's still here. This feels off. When patrol officers arrived, the front door was locked, curtains drawn, the mailbox still full. Officers knocked again. No response. Body-worn camera footage later confirmed there was no movement inside. After a brief perimeter check, they forced the door open. The house was neat, furniture in place, no signs of forced entry or struggle in the living room. A family photo still hung above the mantel, a man, a woman, and three smiling children posing on the beach. It had been taken just a year earlier. Upstairs, they found the first body. Naoko Oda, 48 years old, was lying beside the bed in the master bedroom, face up, eyes partially open. Blood had pooled around her left side. She had been stabbed multiple times. There were bruises on her forearms consistent with defensive wounds. Her watch had stopped at 2:19 a.m. In the bedroom across the hall, Sakurako Oda, 17, lay in bed with a single stab wound to her chest. Her arms were under the blanket. There was no sign she had woken up. Two other children were found in adjacent rooms. Orion, 12, appeared to have struggled, his bed sheets tangled, a shallow cut along his left hand. Nana, just 10, had been killed in her sleep. Her stuffed animal was still tucked under one arm. The final body was found in the hallway, seated against the wall. Male, late 40s, shirt soaked in blood. A kitchen knife was embedded in the upper chest, angled sharply inward. The blade had punctured the heart. Based on the pooling and lack of active bleeding from other wounds, the medical examiner would later determine that this man died last, after everyone else in the home. By 10:10 a.m., the scene had been fully secured. Crime scene techs began a structured walkthrough. Cameras mounted inside the home had been unplugged. Not ripped, not smashed, just methodically disconnected. There was no sign of a struggle downstairs. Every item was in its place. On the kitchen counter, two mugs, one half filled with tea, still faintly warm. There was no forced entry, no notes, no obvious motive. Just five members of a family, all dead. Neighbors began gathering by late morning, standing behind police tape in stunned silence. Several had known the family for years. One described them as quiet, respectful. They waved, smiled, kept to themselves. Another said the kids were polite and smart, often seen riding scooters up the block. No one could remember a single police call to that address before. The man found dead in the hallway was quickly identified through wallet ID as Paris Oda, 46, husband of Naoko and father to the children. By noon, Honolulu police had confirmed that all individuals found inside the home were related. There were no surviving family members present in the house. Detectives from the HPD Criminal Investigations Division arrived shortly after. Among them was Lieutenant Lena Akana, a 19-year veteran and former federal liaison officer. She took immediate command of the case. Her first instinct: this wasn't a home invasion. The house was untouched, not ransacked, nothing missing. A whiteboard was set up on site. Photos of the rooms were printed and pinned, body positions marked, knife location logged. Preliminary findings were unnervingly symmetrical. But symmetry, as Lieutenant Akana would later remark, isn't always natural. Autopsy scheduling began the same afternoon. The Honolulu Medical Examiner's Office assigned two pathologists for a case they already anticipated would become the most complex familicide in the state since the 1999 Xerox shooting. Officers collected fingerprints, swabbed every light switch, lifted partial shoe prints from the stairwell. There was only one unique pattern found throughout the upper floor. Size 10.5, Paris's size. Outside, a growing circle of press began appearing by mid-afternoon. Police issued a basic press statement. 5 deceased, no suspect at large, no active threat to the community. What they didn't say was that homicide detectives were already debating how to frame what they'd seen. One asked, "Do we treat this as one killer or 4 victims and a suicide?" The answer wasn't obvious. Not yet. There was one more thing. Downstairs in the home office, a laptop had been left open but locked. Officers recovered it for digital analysis. There were no fresh fingerprints on the keyboard. However, one USB drive was still plugged in. No immediate access. A warrant would be required. By 3:45 p.m., the home was sealed as an active crime scene. A temporary command post was established in a neighbor's garage. Forensics began mapping timestamps. Surveillance footage from nearby homes was requested. The nearest security camera on the block belonged to a neighbor 2 doors down. Its angle was limited, but it recorded the front of the Oda home, at least partially. At 8:07 p.m. that night, that neighbor's footage revealed the porch light had turned on at exactly 2:11 a.m. No one is seen entering or leaving the home. It turned off at 2:23 a.m. That was the only motion recorded on the entire block during that window. From a distance, the Oda family fit the mold of a Hawaii success story. A licensed chiropractor, a stay-at-home mother, 3 bright children enrolled in reputable schools, a mortgage on a quiet street in Manoa, no known history of police contact, no prior domestic calls, no red flags. By mid-March 2024, local media had begun assembling that image. News anchors described the family as quiet, hard-working, well-liked. Neighbors told reporters the Odas were polite, but kept to themselves. They weren't the barbecue type, one resident said, but the kind you'd trust to bring your packages in if you were out of town. But as Lieutenant Lena Akana's team began their background sweep, the facade started to show cracks. Digital records pulled from Paris Oda's chiropractic license renewal indicated his office had been listed as inactive since July 2023. A follow-up inquiry confirmed the Manoa Wellness Clinic had been shuttered for several months. Public tax documents revealed more. IRS liens were active on both Paris and Naoko for failure to file in 3 consecutive tax years. They owed a combined estimated $82,000 in federal and state back taxes. From the outside, the lights stayed on. The lawn was trimmed. The mortgage, $3,400 monthly, was still being paid. But the income stream behind that lifestyle had been drying up. Investigators tracked Paris's vehicle GPS logs. His SUV had been routinely active between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., far outside normal clinic hours. Subpoenaed transaction data from Uber Technologies confirmed he had registered as a driver in August 2023 and had logged over 200 rides by February 2024. The shift in employment was not reflected in any public profile or household correspondence. That discrepancy mattered. Akana's report noted that financial pressure is one of the top predictors in family-side cases, particularly those involving high-control personalities with no documented criminal history. But at this stage, no formal conclusion had been drawn. What remained difficult to reconcile was the absence of outside intervention. No reports from schools, no documented counseling or mental health services. The 3 children had been enrolled and attending as normal. Their teachers described them as bright, alert, and well-adjusted. None had mentioned issues at home. To verify further, investigators examined the family's digital devices. School laptops, email inboxes, and browsing histories were forensically cloned. So far, no threats, no distress signals, no obvious signs of planning or abuse. The oldest child, Sakurako, had exchanged texts with classmates about an upcoming math exam just the afternoon before her death. Nothing raised flags. A single phrase in a private draft email, recovered from Naoko's Gmail trash folder, was noted. "If things don't improve, I may need to take the kids back to Japan by summer." Dated January 14, 2024. Never sent. Detectives could not determine whether Paris ever saw that message. Additional testimony came from a former patient of Paris, interviewed by HPD on March 12th. He recounted a session in late 2023 when Paris made an unusual comment. "It's hard to be the one everyone relies on. Some days I don't even feel here." The remark was vague enough not to cause concern at the time, but with context, it now carried different weight. Forensics next turned to household utilities and device logs. Power usage from the main residence showed a surge from 1:55 to 2:27 a.m. on March 10th, consistent with lighting use across multiple rooms. Internet router logs showed 3 devices active during that window: the main desktop, a mobile phone, and a smart speaker. Playback data on the speaker indicated it had been used at 2:04 a.m. to play soft classical music for approximately 16 minutes. None of the victims were known to listen to music at that hour. Crime scene analysts revisited the main floor, looking for evidence of sedatives or prescription medications. No pill bottles or open containers were found in common areas. Toxicology results were still pending. A blood pattern analyst identified a near-perfect absence of cast-off spatter in 2 of the children's rooms. That suggested a controlled attack, likely while the victims were asleep. No defensive wounds were noted in the preliminary autopsy summaries for the younger 2 children. Only the oldest showed signs of possible movement prior to death: a bent wrist, slightly shifted shoulder, and a shallow surface abrasion on her right knuckle. The medical examiner could not confirm if she was conscious at the time. The next step in the investigation would be a full reconstruction of the household's final 24 hours. But by the end of day 3, one pattern was starting to settle in. There were no suspects, no sign of outside involvement, no struggle. The family hadn't been ambushed. They'd simply gone to bed and never gotten up. The exterior of the Oda residence offered no insight, no damage, no signs of entry or flight. But inside, the house was speaking, not loudly but in layers, and investigators knew that to understand what happened, they had to listen to the small things: router logs, power patterns, the timing of switched lights, and movement between rooms. When human witnesses fall silent, technology doesn't. On March 13, 2024, 3 days after the discovery, Honolulu PD's Digital Forensic Unit finalized their preliminary data extraction from the smart home network. The Odas, like many middle-class families, had several connected devices: smart lighting, a home security hub, voice-activated speakers, and a dual-band router that stored usage history in 15-minute intervals. These logs wouldn't offer motive, but they could provide the sequence. The router's IP packet logs showed a spike in network activity between 1:57 a.m. and 2:23 a.m. on March 10th. Within that window, 3 specific devices became active: the desktop computer in the home office, Paris Oda's personal smartphone, and the smart speaker mounted in the living room ceiling. Playback data showed a request made at 2:04 a.m. to stream a classical music station. No voice match required. The volume had been kept low. Lighting data tracked movement in 5 zones: kitchen, staircase, hallway, master bedroom, and 2 of the 3 children's rooms. All lights were turned on manually between 2:01 and 2:20 a.m. None were motion triggered. This suggested deliberate navigation through the house, not random activity or panic. From a structural standpoint, the sequence was tight. Detectives mapped the activation times against the physical layout. First movement was logged in the kitchen at 2:01. Stairwell lights came next. Master bedroom at 2:07. Sakurako's room at 2:11. Orion's at 2:14. Nana's at 2:17. Finally, the hallway lights illuminated at 2:21, 4 minutes before the suspected time of the last death. The Oda home had no internal surveillance, but those timestamps, cross-verified by utility data, established a working order. Investigators would later align those entries with the preliminary autopsy results from the coroner's office. Time of death estimates, though approximate, supported the pattern: first Naoko, then Sakurako, then the younger children. The final timestamp on the master router log was 2:27 a.m. After that, all systems went dormant. No calls were made, no texts, no browser activity. That absence, detectives noted, was as telling as any message. Detective Akana pushed the forensic lab to prioritize toxicology. The OME, Office of the Medical Examiner, returned early results on March 14th. No alcohol, no opioids, no benzodiazepines detected in any of the children. Nyoko's report showed trace caffeine and ibuprofen. Nothing unusual. All 5 victims had died from sharp force trauma. The eldest daughter had one post-mortem superficial wound, likely accidental. The rest had clean entries, no prolonged suffering. The murder weapon, identified as a standard kitchen carving knife, was recovered from the hallway, embedded in the adult male. Its blade measured 8.5 inches. Blood trace analysis confirmed it had been used on all 5 victims. One weapon. No secondary blades. The crime was contained. A digital warrant granted access to the family's primary desktop. What they found was minimal. No stored documents, no browser history post-February. The recycling bin had been emptied. Only one file had a recent modification timestamp, a spreadsheet labeled March Breakdown, created on February 27th. It contained household budgets, income projections, and estimated tuition payments for the next 3 years. Every column was red. The document had no notes. No emails had been sent from that account in over a week. That lack of digital communication was unusual. No drafts, no goodbye messages, not even a calendar event. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a minor anomaly in the electrical usage chart. Hawaiian Electric Company records showed a brief voltage spike in the Oda residence at exactly 2:19 a.m., lasting under 1 minute. When cross-referenced with power logs inside the house, the only appliance triggered during that moment was the hallway outlet, where a floor lamp had been plugged in. That lamp was not found at the scene. Photos taken by the forensic team showed the outlet was scorched. Residual charring suggested it had been recently overloaded. Upon re-entry, detectives recovered the base of a broken lamp beneath a hallway table. Shattered glass, but no bulb. Lab analysis later confirmed it bore trace blood consistent with transfer contact. There was no spatter pattern, just smeared contact. This suggested one possibility, a brief struggle in the hallway, possibly the final act. But no witness heard shouting. Only one tenant, living behind the home, reported a single, short scream around 2 a.m., followed by silence. In his words, it was sharp, high-pitched, like a panic yelp. Then nothing. He did not report it until morning. For Akana, the consistent thread was control. No broken doors. No dragged bodies. The cleanup wasn't neat, but it was quiet, methodical. Even the disposal of the lamp showed signs of post-act concealment. Yet the killer had left everything else untouched. The trash hadn't been taken out. The dishwasher was half loaded. No attempt had been made to flee. No cover story created. If it was rage, it was focused. If it was planned, it was isolated. And isolation was becoming a theme. In private notes filed that evening, Akana made a single margin remark. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In the days following the discovery of 5 bodies inside the Oda residence, detectives shifted from analyzing data to collecting voices. The digital timeline was tightening, but digital patterns rarely reveal intention on their own. For that, you turn to people. Those who observed quietly, interacted briefly, or sensed something they couldn't fully explain at the time. The team interviewed 37 individuals connected to the Oda family within the first week. Neighbors, colleagues, former patients, school administrators, and one house cleaner. Each offered details, sometimes trivial, sometimes conflicting. But viewed collectively, the inconsistencies told a story of rising pressure, noticed by others, but never addressed directly. Paris Oda had been largely absent from the social fabric of his own neighborhood. According to interviews with residents along Pekanu Street, he rarely participated in neighborhood events, declined invitations, and limited casual conversation. One neighbor said he would nod politely, but kept walking, even when greeted. Others noted he hadn't been seen outside the house during daylight for weeks. The last known public interaction came from a grocery store cashier who recalled a brief conversation in late February. Paris had purchased a large quantity of instant ramen and canned soup. When asked if there was a sale, he'd replied, "It's just cheaper to stock up." He paid in cash. It wasn't unusual, but it wasn't normal for him either. Meanwhile, Naoko remained the primary point of contact for the children's school. Teachers at Mid-Pacific Institute described her as attentive, always responsive to emails and present at conferences. But one instructor recalled a shift beginning in January 2024. Naoko had missed a parent workshop and failed to return a phone call. The reason she gave later, "Things have been busy at home," didn't raise concern at the time. Among the most telling details came from Orion's 6th grade homeroom teacher, who reported that the boy had seemed disconnected during the last 2 weeks of February. His assignments were incomplete, and he had stopped attending after-school robotics. When asked, he said he wasn't feeling well, but hadn't gone to the nurse. The teacher didn't flag it. There were no behavioral issues, and academically, Orion was still above grade level. From the outside, these were data points without direction. But in hindsight, they formed a pattern, a family pulling inward. One former patient, a woman who had seen Paris regularly from 2018 to 2021, requested to speak off record. According to her account, Paris had exhibited signs of burnout years before, frequently venting about the cost of running his practice and expressing frustration with how easily people quit when things get hard. He'd never made threats or alluded to violence, but she remembered the tone shifting from stressed to fatalistic. Detectives flagged the conversation, but noted the lack of any direct correlation to the event. The patient hadn't seen him in over 2 years. Still, the sentiment matched emerging forensic and financial data. Downward trajectory, concealed from public view, but noticed by those paying attention. The house cleaner, who worked for the family once a month, had a more recent observation. During her last scheduled visit in early February, she found the home unusually quiet. None of the children were present. Paris was home, seated at the dining table with a closed laptop, and did not acknowledge her arrival. Naoko had instructed her by text to only clean the downstairs. The cleaner remembered one detail clearly. The trash bins in the garage were full, but not placed out for pickup. That would be her final visit. The next appointment, set for March 9th, had been canceled the day before via a short text from Naoko. "Let's skip this one. I'll reschedule." She never did. In parallel, detectives contacted Naoko's extended family in Japan. Her younger sister confirmed they had spoken by phone in late January and that Naoko had mentioned concerns over the family's finances. According to the sister, Naoko expressed interest in sending the children to Japan for the summer to reset. The sister reported no urgency or distress in the conversation, only the sense that Naoko felt tired. From that same call, the sister recalled one line that stood out, though she hadn't thought about it until she was asked directly. "I don't think Paris is sleeping much. He's up all night, just thinking." That line was added to the official case file, not for what it said, but what it hinted at. By the end of week 1, the behavioral profile being assembled was more psychological than criminal. There were no reports of domestic violence, no prior complaints, no criminal background for either parent, no custody disputes, no documented threats. And yet the house was now a sealed crime scene, its occupants all dead. The question became not just how it happened, but how no one intervened when so many had quietly sensed that something was wrong. Sometimes people see signs. They just don't recognize them in time. On March 15, 2024, 5 days after the scene was processed, the full autopsy reports arrived at the Honolulu Police Department. Each one marked a transition point in the investigation, from what was observed to what was verified. The bodies of Naoko, Sakurako, Orion, Nana, and Paris Oda had been examined in sequence by 2 forensic pathologists working in parallel, supported by trauma pattern analysts. What they delivered wasn't speculation, it was structure. Naoko Oda's cause of death was listed as multiple stab wounds to the chest and upper abdomen, with at least 2 wounds deep enough to puncture the heart and left lung. She had defensive wounds along both forearms, primarily the ulna side, consistent with instinctive blocks. One injury near her left wrist suggested she had attempted to grip or push the blade. Based on hemorrhagic patterns, she remained conscious for 20 to 30 seconds after the first wound. Blood loss was rapid. She collapsed beside the bed as the lividity patterns showed. Sakurako, 17, had a single penetrating wound to the chest. The entry point was clean, angled downward, striking the right ventricle. There were no other injuries. She had been under covers when stabbed, with only a slight displacement of her bedsheet. Her hands bore no signs of trauma. Cause of death, stab wound to the heart while asleep. She likely never woke up. Orion's autopsy showed one fatal wound to the upper neck, severing the carotid artery, and a secondary shallow wound near the clavicle. There was bruising on his right wrist, consistent with a brief struggle. A small cut on his palm suggested he had attempted to push something away or catch the blade. His body had been turned on its side post-mortem. Investigators concluded he had been alert and possibly sitting up when attacked. Nana, the youngest, died from a single wound to the sternum. No bruising, no defensive injuries. Blood spatter matched the pillow edge, confirming the attack occurred while she was still lying down. She died within minutes. Her cause of death was recorded as sharp force trauma with cardiac penetration. Each of the children was killed with precise, directed strikes. Not erratic, not chaotic. Paris Oda, 46, was the last to die. His body, seated upright in the hallway with the weapon still embedded, showed a self-inflicted wound to the upper chest, angled inward and downward. The knife had pierced through the fourth intercostal space, cutting into the pericardial sac and striking the heart. The pathologist ruled it consistent with a deliberate act. He had no other injuries apart from the single lethal wound. Toxicology across all 5 victims returned negative for sedatives, alcohol, or prescription opioids. There were no signs of restraint, suffocation, or poisoning. This wasn't a method layered with complications. It was direct. The timeline, now reconfirmed against medical evidence, matched what investigators already suspected. The attacks likely began just after 2 a.m., starting with Naoko. Time of death estimates, matched against environmental temperature and livor mortis onset, placed her death first. The children followed within the next 15 to 20 minutes, based on clotting and rigidity patterns. What remained most troubling was the emotional silence around it. The forensic team expected signs of disarray, hysterical injury patterns, evidence of second-guessing, hesitation marks. But there were none. The wounds were committed, confident, controlled. And that control was the most disturbing part. In most domestic murder-suicides, autopsies reveal confusion, misdirected wounds, failed attempts, erratic force. Here, the only injury to the killer was the final, deliberate strike. That contrast suggested a mental state not of chaos, but resolution. A medical report is not built to explain motive, but sometimes the clarity of its findings removes all room for fantasy. One line stood out from the coroner's summary. There was no indication of a spontaneous or defensive confrontation from the majority of victims. That didn't just support the hypothesis of premeditation. It suggested the killer waited for the house to fall asleep, moved room to room without panic, and knew the layout well enough to navigate in darkness. There were no missed targets, no survivors, no calls made. Cases like this don't conclude with new evidence. They stabilize through consistency. Every report, every room, every angle kept circling the same point. This wasn't random. It was internal, quiet, decisive. By March 18, 2024, Honolulu PD's digital forensics team had completed a sector-level recovery of the Oda household's electronic devices. The laptop found powered off on the downstairs desk, an older model Dell XPS, contained no active documents, no recently opened programs, and no saved emails. At face value, it looked abandoned. But at the storage level, traces told another story. The operating system had been wiped of most recent files. The recycle bin was emptied. Browser history had been cleared. No cloud syncs were enabled. However, the recovery team located fragments of deleted documents in the drive's unallocated space. Data carving software reconstructed partial content from 3 Word documents and a spreadsheet, all deleted in the week before the murders. The most significant file was labeled Letter Draft 4.docx. It was incomplete, with only the first 147 words recovered, but the tone was unmistakable. It was written in first person, addressed to an unnamed recipient, and referenced pressure, taxes, and being tired of pretending. The last sentence fragment read, "They don't deserve the mess I've left them in, but I can't see another." There was no signature, no date field, but the metadata showed the document was last modified on March 8th at 11:27 p.m., roughly 30 hours before the estimated time of death. The other 2 documents, March expenses projected and debt layout notes, outlined a bleak picture. They listed payment schedules for business loans, IRS penalties, overdue school fees, and credit card minimums. The notes included projected revenue from selling the office lease and unloading the house before June. One bullet point simply read, "Life insurance access if they pass first, confirm clause." Investigators requested policy documentation. The family had a life insurance policy valued at $700,000, structured in 2019. The payout, however, would be nullified in cases of self-harm within the exclusion period. That clause had expired in 2022. Technically, the beneficiaries, now deceased, were still listed as Nauko and the three children. With no surviving family, the payout would be held by the estate, pending probate. This detail didn't prove intent, but it reframed motive. The financial spiral wasn't just personal. It had reached a point where the death of the family would activate the only remaining asset. Beyond the documents, browser artifacts revealed recovered search terms from late February through early March. The following entries were flagged: how deep to stab to hit heart, can you kill someone in their sleep with one stab, knife versus gun success rate homicide, how long to bleed out carotid. Each search had been made using private mode, but remnants were stored in swap files and browser cache. No searches were found regarding mental health support, suicide prevention, or escape plans. The forensic team also examined Paris Oda's mobile phone. The call log was empty for March 9 and 10. The text message folder contained a string of deleted threads, most of which were recoverable. A set of messages exchanged with Naoko between March 2 and 7 showed rising tension about school payments and tax notices. Her tone, while calm, conveyed increasing concern. His responses were brief, often one-worded. The final sent message from his phone, time-stamped March 9th at 5:11 p.m., read simply, "I'll handle it." That was the last communication issued from his device. Digital investigators noted the overall pattern: concealment, not broadcasting. Most offenders in familicide cases leave some record, notes, manifestos, apology videos. But here, only fragments remained, and none of them were shared. There was no mass email, no social media post, no last-minute call. It suggested internal collapse, not outward defiance. Everything about the digital footprint pointed to someone who had made up his mind and didn't want interference. This was when the team shifted their lens. Instead of searching for why he did it, they focused on why he didn't stop. The technical evidence painted a psychological profile of someone who saw no way out, but still managed his digital house before destroying the real one. Forensics doesn't just catch mistakes, it documents preparation. On March 20th, 2024, 10 days after the crime scene at 2327 Pecano Street was sealed, Honolulu police held their first full press briefing. The tone was clinical. No suspect was at large. The deaths were ruled a murder-suicide. The case was considered closed. Questions from the press focused on motive, warning signs, and whether anything could have been done. Answers were limited. What investigators had was a sequence. What they didn't have was explanation that would satisfy the public. By then, local media had already labeled it the Manoa Massacre. The Honolulu Star-Advertiser ran 3 consecutive front-page stories, and morning news anchors shifted from weather updates to psychological autopsy panels. But coverage remained measured. Hawaii doesn't often face events of this scale, and when it does, the community tends to react with silence before judgment. Outside the Oda home, makeshift memorials appeared by day 4. Bouquets, origami cranes, drawings from classmates of the children. At least 200 people gathered at a candlelight vigil organized by Mid-Pacific Institute, the private school all 3 children attended. Teachers who had never interacted with the family still showed up. A printed program listed only first names. No mention of cause, no mention of who. Detectives did not attend. Internally, the department's position was clear. Community events were not investigative ground. Still, Lieutenant Akana reviewed footage later. She recognized faces of those who'd spoken to her during interviews. Most didn't speak at the vigil. They stood in silence. The police department received 2 formal complaints following the case closure. One, from a retired social worker, questioned why no wellness checks had been performed during the family's economic downturn. The second came from a former patient of Paris Oda, who expressed frustration that no red flag mechanism had existed in Hawaii to alert authorities about deteriorating mental health in licensed medical professionals. Neither complaint resulted in policy review. Hawaii, like most states, has no centralized behavioral alert system for self-employed healthcare workers without active malpractice complaints. Internally, HPD logged the case as domestic murder-suicide closed. The file was submitted to the Hawaii Department of Health for statistical record-keeping under homicide classification, though the lead officer noted no indication of third-party involvement, forced entry, or struggle at the scene. The FBI was not called in. There was no federal interest, no interstate element. The only outside agency to request case materials was the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, a behavioral science division that tracks familicide patterns nationally. HPD provided full documentation, including autopsy records, recovered digital evidence, and psychological indicators gathered from community interviews. Their request came not for active investigation, but for future prevention modeling. On March 25th, one more procedural development occurred. The Office of the Medical Examiner issued the official death certificates for all 5 victims. Under cause of death, Naoko, Sakurako, Orion, and Nana were listed with homicidal violence by sharp force injury. Paris Oda's certificate read self-inflicted injury by sharp force. No additional annotations were made. The bodies were cremated privately by extended family members who flew in from Japan. No public service was held. After the final press mention faded, the only updates came from online message boards, Reddit threads, Facebook pages, private forums for true crime communities. Discussions rarely centered on forensic data. Most centered on disbelief. How a man with no criminal record, no diagnosis, and no outward signs could extinguish an entire family in one night. Some users speculated financial fraud. Others raised conspiracy theories. But in the formal documentation, the facts remain consistent. A failing business, overwhelming debt, isolation, digital preparation, and no clear appeal for help. What echoed longest was what wasn't said. Communities tend to look outward after something like this, searching for warning signs they missed. But in cases like the Oda murders, the collapse happened inward. There was no note left on the fridge, no phone call placed to a friend, no one to stop him because no one had been told to try. On March 6, 2024, the Honolulu Police Department formally closed the investigation into the Manoa familicide. No arrests were made, no court dates scheduled, no plea bargains debated. The only suspect, Paris Oda, was confirmed dead, self-inflicted stab wound to the neck, surrounded by the bodies of his wife and 3 children. What remained was not a pursuit of justice, but an autopsy of collapse, of a man, of a family, and perhaps of a silent system that missed too many signals. From the outset, the physical evidence was consistent with internal homicide and planned suicide. Entry points to the home were locked from within. No defensive wounds on the victims. No signs of forced struggle in any room but the living area where Naoko Oda had last stood. Blood spatter patterns indicated she was attacked from behind while folding laundry, consistent with preliminary assumptions. The children, ages 6, 9, and 11, were found in their beds, covered neatly, showing signs of suffocation with no visible trauma. It was systematic, chilling in its efficiency. The knife used in Paris Oda's suicide matched one from the kitchen set, wiped clean, and relocated to the living room where he bled out. Digital forensics filled the remaining gaps. Search histories on Paris's devices revealed patterns of detachment and preparation. In the 90 days leading to the incident, his online activity shifted from real estate consultation forums to Japanese language suicide forums and searches for painless ways to die with family. Of particular note was a deleted draft email to Naoko dated 2 weeks prior, recovered from an encrypted cache that read simply, "I'm sorry, I can't fix it." Investigators examined his bank records and financial logs in depth. What they found wasn't bankruptcy, but erosion. Paris had drained retirement accounts and taken out short-term loans to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He hadn't told Naoko. She was still depositing her part-time earnings from the campus library job. Her final purchase, time-stamped 9:17 p.m. on February 27th, was a bag of seaweed snacks and a bottle of cold barley tea, items their youngest daughter liked. There were no threats, no prior domestic violence calls, no restraining orders. On paper, they were a stable family with declining income. In practice, they were a dam with invisible cracks. Toxicology reports showed no drugs, alcohol, or sedatives in any of the victims. Paris himself had trace levels of an anti-anxiety medication, unprescribed, acquired illegally online according to his browser history. Experts speculated he had taken it to calm himself prior to the murders, but not in a dose strong enough to impair motor function or decision-making. The community response ranged from disbelief to desolation. At Manoa Elementary School, a row of teddy bears and origami cranes gathered under the cherry blossom tree in the schoolyard, an impromptu memorial for the Oda children. Teachers described them as bright, polite, and tightly bonded. There had been no outward behavioral changes in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Culturally, the tragedy struck a nerve. Hawaii is no stranger to crime, but familicide on this scale is exceedingly rare. In a state where multi-generational homes are common and family ties held sacred, the Manoa case felt like a rupture. Local social workers pointed out the absence of preventative infrastructure for families under psychological and financial strain, especially immigrant households like the Otis, navigating cultural expectations while isolated from extended kin. There was no funeral broadcasts, no press conference from surviving relatives. Naoko's cousin in Osaka declined all interview requests, stating only that the family prayed for peace, not headlines. In late April, a quiet cremation was conducted at Nuanu Memorial Park. No public eulogies were given. Only a thin funeral notice in the Honolulu Star-Advertiser marked their passing. From a forensic standpoint, the case had reached its limits. The scene was clean. The digital trail was sufficient. Motive, though blurred, leaned toward despair rather than cruelty. But from a narrative standpoint, it left investigators with a vacuum. What pushes a man who once hosted charity fundraisers and taught his son to surf at Ala Moana Beach to methodically kill everyone he loves, then himself? There are no easy answers, no satisfactory closure. But within the data and silence are uncomfortable truths. Families can break without sound. Men under pressure can implode without warning. People who appear intact on the surface may be corroding beneath, and no algorithm can detect that in time. I've walked you through the facts, the bodies, the evidence, the silence that followed. But if there's one thing this story taught me, it's this. Silence is not peace. If you're struggling, if the walls are closing in, speak, ask, connect. Because no paycheck, no facade, no pressure is worth the cost of a life, let alone a family. Let this be a reminder, check on your strong friends. And if you're the one who's barely holding on, know this. Your breaking point doesn't have to be your end. What do you think drives a person to this edge? Could this have been prevented? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. If this story hit home, share it, and don't forget to subscribe for more real cases that matter.